You're watching Between the Lines with your host, Dan Gray.
Good evening. You're watching Between the Lines. I'm with Dr. Glenn Doyle out of Chicago, and I'm going to let him introduce himself. Thanks for joining me, Glenn. What do you specialize? Let's just go with the start of what's your background?
Well, I am it's great to talk to you, Dan. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I'm licensed here in Illinois, and I'm also licensed in Washington, D.C. I have a practice in both locations. And what I really specialize in, what I work with the most are people who have experienced trauma. So I work with folks diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and disorders that kind of revolve around trauma-based disorders. So I work with a lot of folks who struggle with addiction. I work with a lot of folks who struggle with what are called dissociative disorders, which are types of really intense post-traumatic disorders. Also work with a lot of folks who just really struggle with everyday functioning, anxiety, and performance anxiety, and these kinds of things. So I work with both individuals, but I also do groups, and I also do a lot of consultations. Other therapists who don't have as much experience with trauma or dissociative disorders as I do, like I give consultations so they can help them work with their clients as well. So.
Given that and knowing this is your background, what is, in your opinion, at the heart of most addictions?
Well, I think of addiction as, there are lots and lots of theories about how addiction works, and people come at it from a lot of different angles. So there are definitely biological factors at work, right? Like people have biology that inclines them toward addiction. Like I have that in my family, that's, for generations. It's something that's just known about my family that we are susceptible to addiction. I have that in my life. So there are biological factors. There are also factors that have to do with our history. So trauma, the thing that I work with most definitely, plays into, people's vulnerability to addiction. Our attachment style really plays into our vulnerability to addiction. So there are historical factors there as well. Then there are things like situational stress and situational trauma that kind of play into vulnerability to addiction as well. So there are all sorts of things that go into it. But the way that I tend to look at it, and I'm kind of biased based on what I do and most of the people I see, but I think of addiction as the type of thing that we develop as a strategy to avoid feeling things that we don't want to feel, right? So when somebody has experienced trauma, usually what that means is that we develop a series of thoughts and feelings and bodily sensations that are really, really uncomfortable. Like most people who have experienced trauma are just jumping out of their skin with anxiety most of the time. You might not know it because they get really good at hiding it, right? But most people, a lot of people who have been through trauma, like really, really depressed. Again, you may not know it because they get really good at hiding it. Go along their day, every single day, they seem to function all the while feeling terribly, terribly depressed. A lot of people who have been through trauma have, these bodily sensations. Either we call them body memories or anxiety responses that happen literally in the cells of our very body.
Yeah, you jump at things that would remind you of the situation that caused you the stress in the first place.
Big time.
Like, it's definitely I know it's a trigger going to certain things for even for myself. It's a trigger to see things like that. But like you said, it seems to be there's a link, right? There's a link between the addiction and the trauma, or a link and the depression, etc. So if you have one or two or three of those things that you just listed off, you're probably even more susceptible, correct?
Absolutely, because the commonality in kind of everything I was just describing is that you've got something going on that is really hard to escape, right? Like if there's something that you can get away from, like a situation that you can get away from, you just try to get away from it. But when we're talking about something that's happening in your own mind or something that's happening in your own body, you really can't escape from it. So we try to develop strategies that allow us a little bit of relief or a little bit of escape. And this is where the things that people tend to get addicted to really come in, like whether we're talking about a substance or whether we're talking about a behavior, right? The commonality is that it allows us to escape this intolerable state of being for even just a minute. Now, when we experience that relief, there's a process called operant conditioning. I mean, it's really simple. It says like, boy, when we're in pain and we discover something that relieves that pain, that takes away what we call a punisher, that behavior will be repeated, right?
Yeah, it's that step, right? Like that's,
Yeah.
if you find something you can escape into, regardless of what it is, whether it's video games or theft or you name it, crime, something that gives you the same rush as whatever you're escaping.
Absolutely.
It seems to be it's an ongoing theme. So here in Sault Ste. Marie, just to give you a little bit of background, we have a fairly intense addiction issue at the moment. Like we're looking at overdose deaths that are doubling what they were in 2018. And some of that is COVID. Like we all know, and I think it would be fair to say that some of that's probably COVID related, but some of it, like you just said, is ways in coping. And when we get back after the break, I want to talk to you a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
You're watching Between the Lines, and I'm with Dr. Glenn Doyle. Thank you for joining me. I'm Dan Graham, Between the Lines. I'm with psychologist Glenn Doyle out of Chicago. We're talking about addictions and mental health today. So we were talking before the break what causes these things and what causes people to reach out to the addiction. You have a unique way of treating addiction. When you inside the circles of psychologists that I've spoken with, you have a reputation of having a unique way to go about it. When you follow your Twitter feed and you follow your Facebook feed, you definitely get that feeling. So how do you approach treatment of these situations?
I don't know how unique I am. I think that I tend to be maybe a little more straightforward than some people in my field. But my main thing is I feel it's really important to make that connection between what we're avoiding and what we get hooked on. Because if we try and treat an addiction, again, whether we're talking about a substance or a behavior or whatnot, and we only focus on that, we're going to be missing a big piece of the puzzle, right? Particularly when we're talking about something like trauma, like so when we're trying to avoid something, as I said in the last segment, like something we literally can't escape because it's in our head or it's in our body, right? That makes us particularly vulnerable to addiction. So I think that it's really important to recognize that link. Recognize that addiction is fundamentally an avoidant behavior. And by the by, makes perfect sense, man. Like, of course we want to avoid, like when we're feeling terrible, of course we want to avoid that. Like, I feel that there's a lot of shame that gets thrown, particularly at folks who struggle with addiction, because, there's, I think, an attitude about like, well, man,
it's a stigma.
Of course, like if you only had a little better character, if you're a little tougher, maybe you wouldn't have to do that thing or use that substance or whatever. Like, look, it makes perfect sense that we would want to avoid the terrible stuff that we're avoiding, our memories or our pain, like, of course. So we have to recognize that link and be really clear. But then we have to really approach it in terms of what skills would I need to not be so desperate to avoid that stuff, right? Like what practical minute by minute skills would I need? Like, so my blog is called Use Your Damn Skills. And it's been called that for years, simply because, again.
And it's extremely helpful.
Thank you. I mean, my thinking is that, boy, we can have all these great theories about trauma, about addiction, about whatever, these beautiful, elegant, overarching theories. But if we don't get down and dirty about skills, about coping skills, minute by minute coping skills, we're screwed. So really the approach that I take is, look, today, Now we're not going to deal with last week, last month, last year, whatever. Today, what are you experiencing today? Right? Like what is the temptation to escape and avoid today? And what do you need today? Like a subset of folks get really frustrated because something that they tried yesterday, like a skill or a tool, and it worked well. But today it's a different thing and it doesn't work well, right? And they get really frustrated. I'm like, dude, that's why we have to take this day by day, minute by minute. Stuff that worked yesterday may not work as well today. But we need to be very realistic about it. And we need to approach it with no shame. Like I always say, it's most important to be on your own side. Like it's really important that we not approach this as, oh, stupid me doing stupid stuff. And why can't I just cut it out? Whatever. So dude, you wouldn't say that to your best friend who was struggling, right? Stupid you doing stupid.
Yeah. So self-talk
is
a big issue. You get up out of bed in the morning and you go, I see dishes, I see, you name it. I don't want to deal with any of it today. I just want to run away. Right. And you're very blunt on your Twitter sometimes and even on your Facebook. And it's a very, back to use your damn skills. Do one thing, right? But if there was one thing that you've learned over your years to speaking to addicts and stuff, if there's that one skill or one task, and I know everybody's different, what is it? Like, what is that one thing that anybody who's addicted that's looking for a different escape than, say, that drug on the street, what is that from your point of view?
Well, the most important thing, just from my point of view, is just do the next right thing. Like we can really, really get up in our heads about how terrible the last minute went, let alone the last month, the last year. Like we can get really up in our heads about what a wreck our life has become. I say, look, in this minute, I don't have a time machine, man. Like I can't jump in the DeLorean and change even what happened a minute ago. What I can do is do this next right thing, this next thing that will help me feel 1% better. Like if you hit up my social media, you're going to hear me talking again and again about 1% in baby steps. Because really, if I can make this next 60 seconds feel 1% better, feel 1% less tense, feel 1% less terrible. Like 1%, dude, when you're in the throes of depression or PTSD or whatever, 1% is a big, big deal. If you're suicidal, 1% is a great big deal. So just focus on the next thing and focus on that next 1%. And that's all you really need. Look, the minute after that, like we'll deal with that when we get there. Trust me, it'll get here. We'll deal with it. Let's deal with this minute, man.
So in light of that, and I know what happens here, I'll walk down the street and I'll see the person who's sketched out or addicted to something and they're having a bad time and maybe they're in that throw of depression. When you see that and you're saying, what's the first thing you say to that individual? Like if they recognize you, if they say, I follow you but I just can't anymore. What's your first piece of advice for that individual?
Well, first things first, it's really important to remember that most people who are struggling or suffering, 90% of the interactions that they have is with somebody who is trying to, in some way, change them or in some way change their situation or in some way, And why does that happen? Well, because, when we see someone who's struggling, it makes us uncomfortable. And we want to somehow change things so we're not as uncomfortable dealing with this person. And in the midst of all that, they very often don't feel as if anybody's actually listening to them. And like no one is taking the time to share that moment with them. And so what I might recommend is if there's somebody who is struggling and who you're trying to help and you don't know what to say, instead of kind of asking the question like, well, what can I say to help them? Say, look, how can I share this moment with them? How can I even take on, like 1% of what they might be experiencing. Because for them, that's probably a unique thing. They don't have a lot of people saying, dude, I don't ask you to change in this moment. I just want to share this moment with you. I just kind of want to get a feel for what is actually happening. And
So
for a lot of folks, when they're, as I say, when they're really deep in that suffering, feeling really alone, feeling really isolated, feeling not like a human, that can be really powerful to just, offer to share that moment with them and not demand they be something different,
and with that, we will be right back at Between the Lines with Dan Gray. I'm with Glenn Doyle out of Chicago, and we will talk after the break. And we're back. I'm back with Glenn Doyle. He's a psychologist who specializes in, I guess we can say, addiction and trauma out of Chicago. So during the break there, we were talking a little bit about the history here in Sault Ste. Marie. And now I'm looking at it as we are looking to get a level 3 addiction rehab center. It's been brought up a couple of times and just pushed aside because demand isn't high enough. Okay, so besides the point that when I talk to people that are actually addicted, they believe so, from your point of view, how, given a level 3 addiction center, is that necessary to help in a city where this is a pandemic?
Well, there are layers to kind of what are called the healthcare delivery systems. And they're like mental health care delivery systems and behavioral health care delivery systems. And those decisions are made at levels kind of above my pay grade. But when you think about the impact of both trauma and addiction on a community, I think it becomes really difficult to argue that it's not a worthwhile investment to make sure that people have as much support as possible. Like, I mean, when you take a look, because I mean, dear Lord, we want to think that addiction, or like a lot of people want to think that addiction is just something that harms the addict, right? Like, they're making a decision, right? There's this cultural attitude about if only they were stronger, better people, blah, blah, blah. But we got to remember that addiction is not something that just hurts the addict. Like, if you've seen what addiction does to families, and if you want to talk in the broader picture about how do we have a strong, united community in the face of something like a pandemic, where we all kind of have to work together and maybe, do some things that we would prefer not to do, make some sacrifices we prefer not to make. How do we create a community that, feels a sense of solidarity? We need strong families. We're going to have strong families. We need to have adequate support for people who are struggling with addiction, because addiction is hell all the way up that spectrum, right? So I think that, look, we need to take a really broad looking approach at some of these things. I mean, addiction, again, like we think of it as an individual thing. It's very much a cultural, it's very much a public health issue. I would say the same thing about trauma. I would say the same thing about mental health generally. There's this stigma, but it's really a public health issue.
So if public removed stigma from addictions, if public removed stigma from trauma, and that if you were only a little bit bigger, stronger, better, etc., is that like a first step in community healing, in your opinion?
I think it's a necessary first step. I don't know if it's a sufficient step, but I absolutely think that, look, we pay a lot of lip service to the idea that there should be no shame attached to mental health struggles. Like we see it on social media all the time. We see like there's no shame in struggling with mental health issues. It's the same as a medical issue, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that idea out there in the zeitgeist that there shouldn't be stigma. But again, when you take a look back at what happened, let me take a step back and take a look at what happens in the real world. You do find a lot of people who are very uncomfortable, like even really talking about it, let alone acknowledging their own stuff. Like something that you mentioned, the pandemic, like something that I've really noticed is that you get a lot of people who are really, really, they'll be upfront about the fact that, it's a bummer that we're in lockdown, and it's a bummer that schools, we would prefer that, et cetera. But when you get a little deeper about like, man, how has this impacted anybody's depression, anybody's anxiety? Very few people really want to go into it because they want to set it up as kind of this false choice between like, what are you saying, that mental health is more important than stopping the spread of COVID? Like, no, that's not what anybody is saying.
So
what we are saying is that we have to be realistic about the fact that, I mean, look, this is a thing,
And is it, everybody talks about that wave. Some people won't recognize they have mental health until they're locked inside with their loved ones or their children or whatever else, and
Right.
can't leave.
Right.
Like, and so that person that is, and I asked this to a previous guest too, that person that is first realizing they have a mental health issue, and there's millions of them right now across North America, and I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that. What's their step? What to stop going down that, I'm going to be addicted to, you name it.
Right.
What's their first step? Like, their 1% might not be too bad. They may be 98% of the 100% jar full. But it's that day where they get up and go, I don't want to deal with this today for the very first time. What is your advice to that individual?
I think the first step for everybody is acknowledging that we are all human beings. None of us are superhuman. Like in our culture, we have this whole thing where we're like, if you are a strong person, then you can weather these things, right? And we don't like to admit that we barely like to admit that we get stressed. Like if you look on social media, when people are talking about stress, it's often in the context of, oh, I'm stressed, ha ha, same, right? I mean, come on. We need to, the first step is admitting, like everybody is susceptible to depression. Everybody is susceptible to anxiety. Guess what? Everybody is susceptible to trauma, right? It has nothing to do with character. And that's the first step. We have to admit that, like, we are all human beings. None of us is a superhero. In fact, those among us who actually are superheroes in my book are those who have actually acknowledged, boy, like I've been really affected by whatever, and I need to take the appropriate steps to make sure that it doesn't ruin my life, my family's life, my career, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the first step, is really admitting, we are human. And by the way, that's cool. Like, we can be human. There's nothing wrong. Like I get crap online when I talk about, look, you are human. You are not the one super achiever who's going to avoid the effects of stress. Like everybody is, no, I'm not. I have character. Well, okay, we're all human, dude. I don't know what to tell you. You're a human being.
Stress is normal, and it's how you cope with said stress that becomes more of the topic, right? So.
Yeah.
So,
and by the way, and no one had to do that. Like no one is just born into the world knowing how to handle a traumatic event, for example. Like we're not born knowing how to do it, right? And some of us haven't had the experiences that teach us how to do that until we get into therapy, and there's nothing wrong with it.
Right. And like you said, until you get into therapy, you may not even realize you have that issue until you get into therapy.
Yeah.
The avoidance, the whatever. So let's hit back on that 1% again one more time. So the theory that you really want to hit home with when you're talking to people about how to maybe get a little bit better.
So it's my experience that most people, when they become aware of pain in their life, what they really, really want to do is hit upon the idea or the theory or the therapist or whatever that will fix it. They're talking about a 100% solution, right? When in reality, that's not how people get better. That's barely how people get unwell, let alone how people get well, right? You're going to overwhelm and disappoint yourself if you're insisting on the thing that makes it all better. Instead of that, like what I say is like, look, you take whatever goal you have in getting healthier, getting well, like whatever it is, you take whatever goal, you chop it in half, and you chop it in half again. Then you take the teeniest, tiniest little part of that, and like whatever one step that would get you started on that, that's your new goal. And I get people telling me, is like, well, I can do more than that. Come on. I have a work ethic. I'm sure you do.
One at a time.
If you have a work ethic, then that 1% should be no problem for you. Just go do the 1%, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if people want to follow you, if people want to get a hold of you, how do they go about doing that? They want to see what you're talking about every day.
So I have a thriving social media community on Facebook. That's facebook.com/Dr. Glenn Doyle. I'm on Twitter at Dr. Doyle Says. I have an Instagram at Dr. Glenn Doyle. And those communities are really very active. We post several times a day. And my blog is useyourdamnskills.com. Post there twice a week. So come and join the community. We're a really open-minded, vibrant community. I'm really proud of my online community.
Well, thank you for joining me today on Between the Lines. I'm Dan Gray. I've been the host of the show and the host of the show every week for Between the Lines, and we will be back next week. Thank you, Dr. Doyle, and we will talk with you again soon.
Thank you, Dan. It was great to talk to you.
You too.